Good evening. Ron W. Henley here with ICC Banter Blitz, sponsored by ICC. We are good to go. So, if you guys want to challenge, get in a few games, and then tonight we have a special presentation on the bishop pair, and we're going to look at the games of Salo Floor. Salo Floor, many people don't appreciate, but Mikhail Botvinnik actually called him the world champion with the white pieces. Okay? And I was just looking online, and I found, incredibly enough, his peak rating was ridiculous in FIDE. Only 2460. But of course, ratings have gone up quite a bit. And
incoming challenge.
Good point there. Let's see. McKnight's challenging. Okay. Always good for excitement. Let me get myself set up, and we are good to go.
Game started.
In the early 60s, when Karpov arrived on the scene, he was not very good at opening play, unlike Kasparov, who loved to prepare long variations. That was not Karpov. And so what the Soviet authorities did was they assigned to help Karpov with the openings. And this turned out to be extremely important in Karpov's development, making tremendous progress in learning how to develop his opening systems. I'm not sure the queen belongs on a5 here, but our main goal here is we need to control the d5 square. So with that in mind, maybe queen back to d8. But I was thinking I might try to save d8 for the rook. No such luck here. He's all over it. Now there, bishop g4 maybe was an interesting idea. With the idea to take the knight, go knight c6. Yeah, that probably was a better way to play. Probably need to shut up and pay a little better attention here to what I'm doing. Now my bishop's boxed in, darn it. How are we going to get these guys out?
Server announcement.
He's building up a very nice formation here. I'm not thrilled with my queen. This does not look good. Problems everywhere. Now, how to get that bishop on c8 out? That's the challenge. Had to run, let the cat in. Also known as the boss. Okay, b6, then knight c6 looked too good for him. Although I guess I could play queen to d6. Anyway, let's try this. Got to get the pieces out. Am I getting in serious trouble here? I hope not. Well, I have to say it does look dangerous. What's he want? He's coming in here. If I go... Well, let's not go crazy. I thought about fancier moves like bishop g4. I don't really want to have to give up my bishop pair if I don't have to, but I may have to. May not have a choice in the matter. And also the bishop pair with these d pawns is not so great, but it can work out in the long run. Yeah, I was thinking about that strange idea, because if I go queen takes bishop, he can go queen takes f7 check, king over, and rook to c7. If I play here, he's got this funny move. Oh, no. If I play f6, he's got that move. Hey, Chihuahua. Queen takes. Okay, don't panic. Don't panic. Oh, and he has queen takes there. No, rook c7. That's the main problem.
Server announcement.
Okay, let's see what's happening here.
Check.
No choice there. This is looking risky, only because it is. Thank goodness he can't play knight takes queen smothered mate. Now I need a move to either go bishop e8 or rook at a to get him out of there. Get him out of there. If he goes rook b7, are we playing rook over? Or bishop back? Now there's some tricky stuff. Ah, I should have played bishop e8, I see. Okay. Got it. Ah, good move. Darn it. He saw that one.
Check. White forfeits on time.
Woo! Good game, sir. Feel like I dodged a bullet. I see Water Power 100 dropped in. Whatever happened to Chess Superstore? Yeah, that was a long time ago, and I think we had to actually let that go when I went down to Wall Street. Okay. Anyway, good game, sir. Way to get my stress level up. Let's see. Yeah, you had a lot of pressure in the opening. E6 was a little bit passive. Should have done something a little better. Nicholas asking, great question. Who do you think will win, Magnus or Nepo? Well, of course, I'm rooting for for Magnus, because obviously, you know, I've done a lot of videos on him and so forth, and I think he's better at promoting chess. But I think Nepo, I mean, eventually Magnus, you know, will cede the World Championship to this younger generation, Firuza, you know, Magalescu, some of these young players. But Nepo is the clear and present danger, as I talked about on one show, because to start with, he's not intimidated. He's around the same age as Carlsen. They even played each other in junior events, and Nepo has like 5 wins and 3 draws in previous games, so he's definitely not intimidated. And that's one of the big factors in trying to dethrone a world championship, is that intimidation factor, overcoming the hurdle. And then the other is his style, extremely active. And this is not going to allow Magnus to get so much into his comfort zone, whereas the 2 previous players, Karjakin and Caruana, like to maneuver quite a bit more. And that kind of allowed long games. So, yes, plus, exactly, Nepo is also very good at rapid and blitz, so he's not going to enjoy the advantage that he had against Caruana and Karjakin as far as overtimes, you know, making him the heavy favorite. So, yeah, I think this is going to be a very, very, very tough match for him. The one criticism of Nepo in the past was that he was a little rash, and sometimes there were holes in his preparation. But over the last 2 years, he's shown a lot more maturity and patience, and he's been working with a supercomputer in Moscow. I saw an article about that. And so his play has definitely, he seems to have elevated and worked on some of his issues. So Tibmag points out that the Latvian Gambit could be a big factor in getting Magnus out of his comfort zone. That would be amazing if we saw Latvian Gambit, you know, in one of the events, in one of the matches. So, let's see. Absent any more challenges, we're going to go ahead and do our bishop pair presentation. Get that out of the way. Now if we go to View, and we go to My Profile, and we go to Games. As I've mentioned in the past, this is one of the things that I quite like, is you have a game library here on ICC where you can store 400 games. And today we're going to look at Salo Floor. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of today's generation are not familiar with him, but if you ask old-time Russians, they have mad respect for him. So with that said, we're going to look at Salo Floor, and let's see. I think we have to go on down here. Here we go. Start with the game Steiner Floor. This game, Floor is plain black. And let's see what happens. He does Caro-Kann, D5, white takes twice. And now rather than recapture, Salo just develops. Well, first he stops stuff from coming to B5. And then knight out. And now you'll see 2 different philosophies here. White tries to hold on to the d5 pawn. These are double d pawns. Not so easy to use, as we'll see in this game. Black, for his part, just mobilizes, and we'll see a lot of delayed gratification in this game. Okay, castles, bishop out. So you can see white has 3 pieces protecting this pawn on d5. Going to be very hard for black to get 3 pieces attacking it. Therefore, black goes into the blockade mode. Knight back to e8, and brings the knight up to d6. Well, castles b6, getting ready to put the bishop on b7. Knight d4, trading off the blockader, takes, and bishop pinning the pawn. So now he is thinking about knight over, recouping the pawn. Black plays bishop g5, or white plays bishop g5, pinning this pawn. Now d6 is in the air, so to speak. Like, definitely a threat. Various pins. But black plays knight to f6 and bishop takes. Now, one of the first points of real interest here. Most players would automatically take with the bishop. Floor, very interestingly, takes with the pawn. Now, by taking with the pawn, these two pawns on the d file become passed pawns. But black also gets the e file for counterplay. And he gets a forward f pawn that he can launch without weakening his king position. So very interesting, very dynamic. Really epitomizes the style of the Soviet players during the 1940s and 50s. So, rook over. Queen to d6. Now, one of the advantages of the bishop pair is quite often it keeps the enemy rooks from penetrating. And we see that case here, where the c6 square is covered. White doubles rooks. Black contemplates taking the pawn. He's got 3 attackers on it. And now bishop back. And here we see first another example of the delayed gratification. If black takes, then this rook penetrates, and the other rook becomes active. So Floor is not interested. Instead, he plays f5. This opens up his dark squared bishop to attack the pawn on d4. The rook defends, and rook over. So you can see, instead of recouping his pawn, black has mobilized his dark squared bishop, his f5 pawn, and his rook on e8. Well, pawn up, rook up. Okay, so once he plays rook up, guarding the 7th rank, he can now seriously consider recouping the pawn. Well, white didn't want to be in a rush to give back the pawn, so he clamps down. But you can see white's got a queen, a knight, and a bishop guarding a doubled pawn on d5, and then he's got another rook guarding the pawn on d4. Well, now black seizes the file. White wants to neutralize that, so he offers to trade a pair of rooks and starts maneuvering on the queen side. Well, with knight a2, it looks like he was thinking about queen to b4, trying to trade queens maybe, or maybe knight to b4 and then sinking the knight in on c6. So, pawn to a5. That controls the b4 square. Well, queen to b5. Now he plays h5. And you can see with the white queen and knight over on the queen side, black starts operations on the king side. Pawn to b4. Now he just ignores him. Full speed ahead. He drops back with the bishop. He takes, and sends in that doubled f pawn we talked about. Well, after pawn up, trying to keep things locked. Very nice. Pawn sacrifice to open up the king side. On bishop takes. Now the queen penetrates. You can see the queen on f4 attacks the bishop, eyeballs the pawn, and supports an attack on the d4 pawn. Queen back. And now a little combination. Bishop takes. When the queen takes this bishop. Now you can see the white king is very, very exposed. In fact, rook to e4 looks pretty much like a killer threat. So the knight comes back into play, guards the pawn, stops the rook from penetrating to e4. Pawn takes pawn, pulls the queen away, and now a little petite combination. You can see the queen on b4 is attacking the rook. It's attacking the pawn on b6, but that's probably not so important because the g4 pawn is under fire. But now Salo exploits the king position with bishop takes pawn on d5. Well, of course he's got the queen and bishop battery, so he's threatening queen to g2 mate. If the knight takes, which is what happens in the game, he can take the rook. If the rook takes, then of course he's got rook down check on e1 and mate on h1. So a beautiful combination to exploit the looseness of the white king side. In the game, white took with the knight.
check.
Then after check, and simply rook up, black is a clear exchange up, thanks to his previous fine dynamic play. But let's look at the technical aspect. Floor also had very good technique. Knight back.
Check.
Check. Trading queens, of course. Now, of course, with this pawn all the way over on a4 and another pawn on the other side on g4, the poor knight, as the Russians say, hops on short legs. The only thing in white's favor here is that there's only 3 pawns apiece left on the board. Rook over. And notice the knight in this situation doesn't really have any good outpost. So, rook up. Now he goes after the last pawn on the board. And here, very interesting move. He goes 2 squares. If pawn takes pawn, then he'll play king up, and then he'll eventually recoup that pawn. So instead,
check.
The knight checks out, and the knight escapes. But then he goes king up.
Check.
And now, very interesting play. He offers up the g6 pawn, just to activate his king, but then rook back. Now we can see the a4 pawn is a goner. But again, delayed gratification. He doesn't rush to take that one. Instead, he checks,
check,
and he eliminates the kingside counterplay. Because the pawn on a4 is so far exposed and so far away, he can come collect that. Okay, so now of course this is pretty routine technique, but still, Floor does it with style. He starts to walk in with his king. And here's the part that I really like. Domination. The white knight is completely trapped, and white resigned. We can see b2, g2, g7, b7. These are like among the worst squares for a knight on the chessboard. You can see, in this case, black only had to cover 3 squares in order to trap the knight. So beautiful display of technique with the 2 bishops by Salo Floor. Okay, now, next game. The rest of these games we'll see Floor with white. Here he's playing Weltemander. I believe this is Soviet Master. Okay, so knight out, c4, b3, bishop b2. And keep in mind, Wesley So of late has been playing moves like e3 and b3 in some of the rapid games. Here he's got the c4 thrown in, but it's kind of a Kali system, I guess, if you will. And now what's impressive about this game, white doesn't do anything really special, okay? Just centralizes, mobilizes, but now, believe it or not, white has a very nice continuation. He starts with pawn takes pawn. Well, of course, pawn takes pawn is an isolated pawn. Not the end of the world, but also not pleasant to have a permanent static weakness against a positional player like Salo Floor. So, of course, black takes with the pawn, with the knight. And after knight takes, now takes with the bishop. But here, rook takes, queen takes, and Floor has spotted the slight flaw in the black position. He now plays a beautiful touch, knight to f5. And we can see the e6 pawn is what we call overworked. It's protecting the bishop on d5, but it's also supposed to be guarding f5. And the knight threatens knight takes bishop check, also threatens to smash in on g7. Beautiful touch, this knight to f5. Now, of course, bishop to f6, you simply trade bishops, and then knight fork on e7. So it's not just the bishop on e7 that's under attack, but it's the square as well. Well, in the game, Weltemander takes,
server
queen takes,
announcement.
And now, voila, white's managed to collect the 2 bishops. Notice that queen to c2, I guess you could take, he takes a bishop, you take a bishop, he takes, and at worst you play queen takes a7 with a solid pawn ahead. You might also have some possibilities of kamikazing your bishop on g7. So, in the game, knight to c5. That way the queen guards the pawn on f5. Well, bishop c4, queen up. And now this kind of surprised me a bit. I thought with 2 beautiful bishops pointing at the king that white would probably want to keep the queens on. However, black would probably play bishop f6, neutralize one of the bishops, and then fight with the knight coming to e4. And not so easy. Floor instead, not only does he trade queens, but he puts the rook on the open file and is willing to trade the rook as well. Because a lot of times when you have the two bishops, you want to actually keep a pair of rooks on the board if possible, just to have more options to swing right, swing left. Now, we have a pure two bishops against bishop and knight. The only defect, slight defect, is that black does have the doubled f-pawns. So let's see how Floor executes this technique. King over, bishop up, pawn up, simply guarding, not allowing bishop takes h2 like in the famous Boris Spassky, Bobby Fischer game. g6, king up, and of course you want to centralize your king, knight back. Now here we do see a little bit of a deficiency with these double d-pawns, because if knight c5 check, the white king would just simply go to d4, on to d5, into c6, and the game would not be too difficult. But instead, knight to c7. So the knight covers b5 and d5 entry points, and even has the possibility of pawn to b5, trapping the bishop. Well, first he plays a4, he goes king f8, and bishop f6. Black plays a6, contemplating b5. Floor very patiently steps back. King over, bishop back. And what you'll see here is tremendous patience with the bishop pair. Realigning the bishop. Now there's possibilities to penetrate to b7. Meanwhile, you're keeping the knight off of d5 and the king off of c6. h5. King comes back. Bishop over. Touching the pawn, asking him what's he going to do about that pawn. Well, in the game, he advances. Now, last week we saw a game by Max Erva, where in this situation, he actually exchanged pawns and brought the pawns closer to the center. And I was a little surprised at that, because in general, you want the pawns as far away so that the bishops have the longer reach. In this situation, we'll see Salo Floor allows the exchange on a4, and then the a6 pawn remains a potential target. In fact, he goes to touch it now. Takes, takes. Well, this exchange, though, also allows the king access to c4. Bishop back, looking for counterplay. Now, when I first saw this game, I was expecting pawn to f3. But instead, Floor plays pawn up, opening up the position just a bit more for his bishops and his king. Okay, so now we get a little maneuvering. King in. Again, delayed gratification. Notice that if you go bishop takes pawn on a6, black has knight to c5 check, forking your king and your bishop. Then the problem you have is that you have to take that, and after bishop takes, you have an opposite colored bishop ending where you only have one extra pawn, not necessarily by a long shot enough to win. So instead, king into d5.
Check.
Check to force him away, and then king over. Now he's threatening some king f6 penetration. We see this a lot in Magnus Carlsen's games, where he has very good in-game play with his king, and really is able sometimes to penetrate deeply into the enemy territory. Okay, so he goes back. He goes pawn up.
Check.
Check. Now each of these little pawn advances bring the pawns closer to the white king. And though like no one pawn advance seems to be terminal, nonetheless, the sum total is eventually they get exposed. Check. Okay, now we see a bit of maneuvering. King up, and he does. On the plus side, black just managed in the last few moves to trade another pair of pawns. There's not a lot to work with. There's only 3 pawns apiece left. On the bad side, keep an eye on the pawn on h5. Well, you could say the pawn on h4 is also weak, but the black bishop has trouble getting to it, whereas the pawn on h5 is definitely going to be a target, as we will see. And so what that means is black is going to have problems because he's got targets to defend on the a file and the h file, which means the knight is going to get stretched out. So watch how magnificently Floor executes the strategy. But no rush. A bit of patience, centralizing the bishop. Okay, again, no rush. Keep an eye on the knight. And now he hits on this plan to advance the f-pawn. Why advance the f-pawn? Well, notice this bishop can't run down here and try and attack this pawn because it's busy defending the knight. The knight's busy defending the a6 pawn. Now he reroutes this bishop.
Check.
He checks. Now the black king only has one square on h6 where it can keep the pawn on h5 defended. And now the bishop still keeps an eye on the a6 pawn. But look how beautiful this bishop is. It keeps an eye on the h5 pawn, and it keeps an eye on the a6 pawn. There's no way this knight, this poor knight, can equal the mobility of this bishop. So now black resorts to tricks. If bishop takes one of the pawns, at least he'll play knight d6 check, recoup a pawn. But here the Russians have a rule I like very much. My pawns are my pawns, your pawns are negotiable. So look what white does here. He does not give up his pawn.
Check.
He checks.
Check.
When the knight hops out, he slides in with the king. The knight is pinned. Black tries to throw him a bone. He says, no, I'm keeping the pin, and I'm threatening to take the pawn on h5. He slides over with the king. Now, he could take the pawn, because you can't play knight takes f5 because bishop g4 pin. But if you take the pawn, he might go bishop g3 and go after that guy. Let's see what he does. He takes it. Now he goes back. Now he comes back. Now notice he was threatening to go knight check and take the pawn, but
check.
When he goes knight check, you drop back with the king, and he still can't take the pawn because bishop b5 check. Some fantastic mobility with the bishops. The king runs away. Now the bishop comes in, attacks the knight. The knight goes back. A theme we've seen many times before. You see this bishop is semi-dominating this knight. Now the king comes back, re-enters.
Check.
Check. Now the king is totally dominating, and the poor knight is in big trouble. The knight goes to the corner.
Check.
But now check. And you can see these two bishops totally driving the king away. The king goes away.
Check.
Check. King goes further away. And now again, he doesn't rush to take the a5 pawn. Instead, he comes back and covers the knight's escape. When the black king goes back, king goes in, attacks the knight is trapped. Notice the h6 square is covered. He can't, there's a pawn on f6, so he can't go there. And when he tries to come out,
check.
You have check, and king takes knight. Beautiful, beautiful example of in-game technique with the bishop pair. And these are the kind of games when I was young, I would study, I'd play through them 3 or 4 times just to, appreciate all the different subtle nuances. And to me, this is really how you develop good in-game technique. Okay? Just classic textbook example. Okay, now, here he's playing a Russian master, I guess about 2450. I remember Petrosian had a game in his 1972 book, How to Open a Chess Game, which was kind of a derivative of the San Antonio 72 tournament. Anyway, here we see again Fleur playing kind of a quiet double fianchetto against the king's Indian defense, and now black goes for Grunfeld, switches gears. Okay, again, nothing too aggressive here. Black launches the a-pawn and goes for kind of a light square strategy, if you will. Okay, takes, knight takes, bishop out, and simply retreats. Again, nothing too aggressive with the white pieces. Okay, knight back. He's got 3 hits on the pawn. Knight, bishop, queen. Well, notice that you haven't pushed the pawn to e4, so you have the nice reserved castles. If he takes this pawn, you could probably think about taking the pawn on b7 on the tail end. He goes knight up, queen up, knight over. Now he's got 4 hits on the pawn. So now you really do need to do something about the pawn, so you use a pawn. Okay, so the black knight has managed to secure the b5 square. Okay, yes, the pawns are fixed. It is attacking the a3 pawn, but as we'll see later, it's not really that great of an outpost. Okay, bishop up. Now what he's trying to do, he's trying to provoke the pawn forward to e4, and then he can continue with bishop g4 or something, and he'll have a lot of pressure on the white center. Floor's not having any of it. He goes back, puts up with a little embarrassment on his rook, and now changes the complexion of the game. Black seems to have managed, to get pretty well placed on the light squares. Notice white's pawns have trouble moving because of e4. The d4 pawn hangs. So it seems like black has generated pretty decent play. But knight to e5, very dynamic move. He takes on the double pawns, but he opens up for his bishop, and he opens the d file. Pawn to c6, blocking the attack on b7. But now the knight comes, and the knight is threatening to go to c5, suddenly becoming a monster. Not only that, the rook is threatening to pin that invading bishop now. Well, black decides to get rid of the knight, but it does cost him the bishop pair. So, and not a typical theme here where white has double pawns, but white has the two bishops. Which is more important? Now in this case, the knight has an interesting outpost on b5, but that's not the same as having a central outpost like on d4 or d5. Queen over. You can see two attacks on the e5 pawn. Queen to c5. Not only defending the pawn, but potentially touching the e7 pawn. Rook over. Rook over. Offering a trade. Pawn up. Okay, so that secures the e7 pawn and freezes the pawn on e5. Bishop back. Queen up. Bishop back. And you can see, very, very patient. When I studied Petrosian's games, this is one of the techniques when he had an advantageous position, but not like completely winning. Sometimes he would tick-tock around a bit and kind of try to jiggle him out of position. So now f4. That secures the e5 pawn. Bishop back. Now black at some point is contemplating trying to play c5 in order to get his pawn majority going and get more pressure on the a3 pawn. So let's see how Floor deals with that. He plays king up, and the problem he had here is that if he tried to play c5, he has to watch out for him trading rooks and stealing this pawn. That's one concern. So black changes gears, trades, and then goes queen to b6. But now that allows the rook to penetrate, and he trades. Now notice you can't play queen takes pawn on a4 unless you want to allow queen to d2 check, picking off your bishop. So the king steps over, guards the d file, and now the threat to play queen takes a4 is very real. So the queen, worth 9.5 or thereabouts, has to guard the pawn worth 1. Well, while that's going on, white gets busy on the other side of the board. And very similar theme we saw before in one of the earlier games, where the black queen and knight are over here on the king side, and so that leaves the black king a little bit exposed. Queen back, king over, and penetration. Now it really is hard for the queen to move. The king can't move, it's got to keep an eye on the bishop. Queen over, bishop back, and now you can see the a4 pawn is attacked, the queen is attacking the b7 pawn. What's black going to do? The queen is totally passive. Full speed ahead. Bishop back, pawn takes, and now the next pawn break. Pawn to g4. And see, he can afford, to move these pawns because the black pieces are all far, far away on the queen side. Well, he tries to get active. He goes pawn to f5. He takes. He takes. He goes knight back, trying to secure the square on e6. And now, a nice move, bishop to d4, offering to trade bishops. Now, of course, that would lead to queen takes knight and an opposite colored bishop ending. Black plays a little trick. Pawn takes. If bishop takes bishop, he has the clever queen a6 check, and then queen takes. But Floor sticks to his plan and just recaptures. And what is the point of these pawn advances? He hasn't won any material, but the point has been to expose the black king. He plays bishop takes. Now, surprisingly enough, he plays queen takes the knight. And you now have queen and bishop of opposite color against queen and bishop opposite color. He's still got this guy under attack, and he's got a can opener to open up that king some more if he needs it. After bishop down, it seems like black has counterplay. But when you have bishop opposite color, either queen and bishop opposite color like we have here, or rooks and bishop opposite color, the initiative, king safety, is generally the single most important factor. Okay? And so look what happens here.
Check.
Bam, check. And you can see the poor black king is just totally exposed. After king up,
check.
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 Check. Check. Check.
And
checkmate.
Checkmate. So, a beautiful example of trading in the bishop pair to get a attack with the opposite colored bishops and queen. Just superb technique, you know, by Floor. Okay, so now the last game I want to share with you actually has a very big impact on history. When Botvinnik was a young boy around 1932, this would have been about, what, 16 years before, you know, he played in the 1948 World Championship Tournament. He played black against Salo Floor in the following game, and he got a real lesson. And that lesson later paid off when he won with the bishop pair against Bronstein in the final decisive game of their match that he had to win with white. And here we can see where he learned his bishop pair lesson. Now again, one of the things we talked about too is that you can design your openings to try and collect the bishop pair. For example, in the queen c2 Nimzo, white's idea is that he wants to play a3, and after bishop takes, quite often take with the queen, most often, collect the bishop pair without having the weaknesses of the double pawns. Okay? But it is a little bit time consuming, and black does get a little bit of temporary lead in development quite often. Now myself, I played this, you know, in the 1980s and 90s. Once I think maybe I beat Nigel Short in a game, but it's very tough. And Karpov also played with black, played with white. Walter Brown played a lot of games with white. So it was quite popular in the 80s and 90s. Anyway, as we can see, c5, d takes c5, knight a6, a3, and
check.
He takes, queen takes, knight takes. So you can see black has good development. Two knights, he's ready to castle. He's probably going to play d5 or d6 or something. He does have to get his other bishop out. Well, f3. That helps control the e4 square. d6. To me, d6 doesn't really quite cut the mustard, because when you're ahead in development, it's like use it or lose it. Okay? And so d6 gives white time to go ahead and mobilize. And so we saw the same thing last week, very similar type opening, in fact, with the game that Dr. Max Erva played. When you play like this, you give white time to just mobilize and secure his space advantage and his two bishops. So now he is contemplating bishop takes the pawn on c4. Well, a little sidestep, and now bishop takes pawn on c4, probably walks into knight d5, and a very nasty pin down the d file, c file. So queen back. Now he's probably threatening to take the pawn for real, But Knight into d5. There, if you'd have played b3, black might have tried b5 to get some counterplay. Knight to d5. Well, after bishop takes, pawn takes,
check,
rook takes, queen takes, queen over, you can see white has a beautiful bishop pair and kind of the white side of a King's Indian space advantage. Okay? Castles, rook over, queen up, and queen taking the c-file. But, just like the previous game, rook over. And
check.
After takes, takes,
Check.
takes, takes, Floor is very happy to play a 2-bishop versus 2-knight in-game where he's got a clear space advantage. And again, the knights don't have any great outpost. Now again, this is 1933. This was before he played the other game, and Botvinnik at this time would have been a pretty young man, relatively inexperienced. Bringing the king up. Okay. And again, tremendous patience. The knight pops up, the pawn goes to b4. Now he could have played the knight into a4 followed by b5. That would have been an option. King comes over, and now he advances the a-pawn. Typical strategy with the bishop pair is to just gradually encroach with your pawns on both sides of the board. Knight attacks, pawn up, back, bishop back. Very, very good patience here. Now, what to do about improving this bishop on e2? Well, first he brings the king over. Then he drops the bishop back, pawn to h4, and there you have it, what I call bishop relocation. Why is the bishop so good on h3? Because with these pawns a bit fixed, just like we saw in the previous game, black has to watch out for this bishop snaking in here and just walking away with some of these queenside pawns. So, one thing for black definitely to keep an eye on and worry about. So, black, for his part, doesn't really have any active counterplay. He's reduced to shuffling back and forth. Now, f6 to me, well, why did he do that? Possibly he was concerned that there was already a concrete threat here to play pawn takes pawn. If knight takes, then you had bishop in, and if pawn takes, then white could win a pawn with bishop takes, king takes, and bishop takes e5. Therefore, he felt compelled to play f6. But as we mentioned, each pawn advance gives the white side more chances to potentially penetrate. And for example, that explains why white would play a move like bishop f5. You don't play a move like bishop f5. It's what we call a probing move, because you expect them to just let you steal the pawn on h7, not even in a blitz game. Black is going to play either h6 or g6. But if he plays h6, then the g6 square is a potential penetration point for your king. And in this game, he chooses the alternative. He plays g6. But now the bishop comes back. Pawn goes to h6. And now you can see he relocates the other bishop. And now he exchanges, once again in a timely fashion. If he takes with the knight, he's got to watch out for the bishop snaking in here and gobbling up his queen side. So therefore, he has to take with a pawn. And now king over. And you can see he unleashes the power of this bishop touching that h6 pawn. Well, the pawn advances. So bishop up, bishop in, pawn up.
Check.
The idea here is to open up the board just a bit. Bishop back. King comes back over to this side of the board. And now Botvinnik tries to break out. He plays pawn up. But after takes, 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 and takes, he's now managed to activate his knights. He is threatening to take the b4 pawn with check. But on the other hand, he has given white an outside passed h-pawn. Bishop drops back, simply guarding the pawn. Knight goes over. So it seems like black's managed to coordinate a bit in the center, but the outside passed pawn is the enemy of the knight. So watch what happens. King over. Bishop in. Now you can see the pawn potentially is threatening just to go all the way in. The bishops are covering all 4 squares.
Check.
Check. Driving the king back. King drops back. Now the plus and minus. The plus is you drove the king back, and you fixed the pawn on b4. The minus is the pawn on a6 is now potential target. If this bishop ever snakes in here, that guy is a goner. Okay, so let's see what happens next. He goes knight back.
Check.
Now he could check. He can afford to offer the trade. If knight takes, king takes, and this outside pass pawn is going to be a problem. So he interposes. But now bishop up. Thanks to the pin, he's threatening bishop takes knight. Knight goes. Bishop back. Knight hops in. Bishop back, guarding the pawn, very patient. And now he covers this square on f5. Knight back. And there you have it. The bishop's touching the a6 pawn. The knights can no longer get over there to guard. So the king goes over. But again, delayed gratification. Does he take the pawn? No. He taps the knight.
Check.
Check. King up. Knight goes back to blockade. Bishop goes back. Bishop up.
Check.
Check. Make the king decide where he wants to go. And now he takes this pawn. Now black has a dilemma. If he doesn't take the bishop will go down to b7 and revisit that a6 pawn. And when he takes, he now has a knight versus bishop ending. Yeah, the pawns are all on the same color as white's bishop, but the key is this passed h-pawn. The bishop hits the knight comes up, pawn advances, the knight tries to block, the bishop harasses the knight, and now he slides over with the king. So you can see a little bit of a zugzwang setting in. If the knight just runs away, the pawn can start advancing. If the king moves, as in the game, he can just slide forward. When he goes back, the pawn starts to advance, and at this point, Botvinnik resigned. So you can see 78 moves of being tortured by the bishop pair. The young Botvinnik learned his lesson well, and later, in game 24 of his 1951 match with Bronstein, he was a point behind. He needed to win to tie the match, retain the title, and he played a beautiful game with 2 bishops against 2 knights. Lesson well learned.
Incoming challenge.
Okay, Nishmedinov, 5-0. He wants to play black. 5-0. Let's have some fun. Let's see what he's got prepared. I have not even looked at this opening since whenever. Let's see if I can remember what you do. Oh, f5. Yeah, that's what they do. And what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to take this? I forgot. Then he has all these different moves he can play. No, when you're pawn ahead, trade. Trade, trade, trade. Not afraid to trade. How bad can it be? I think queen d7 and knight c6 and going that way might have been a little more incisive, shall we say. I mean there, yeah, I could check and take the pawn on b7, but that's not really what we want. I really want to get the rest of the troops developed. Let's go here. Normally I don't put knights on c3 in front of my pawn, but here I have some dream of maybe playing pawn to d5. If he goes knight a6, I'll probably play a6 to keep him off my case. Yeah, knight b4, queen c4, check d5, the bishop would protect. Yeah, I was thinking he might go there, and then I was thinking I want to get this guy out here. Well, to tell you the truth, I also kind of wanted to go knight to g5, try and exploit that e6 square. So here he's just offering trade. Could go back. Why not? Yes, I'm a boring player. And my knight's not happy. Time, what to do? Where should this knight be going?
Server announcement.
Yes, knight e2 might not have been the most brilliant. I kind of wish I had to move f3 in. He's keeping me out. Okay, I get that. I'm not sure about this queen a3. Looks a little fishy, to tell you the truth. And now here I was thinking about rook takes, queen takes a7, queen check, queen here, knight here, queen check, king somewhere, queen here to f4, guards the two threats. The danger is if I miss something, it could be expensive. So let's just play in our usual boring technical manner. I mean, I guess we could have played e4 there. And then he'd get nasty counterplay. Let's just do it this way. Whatever it is we're doing. Aha. I thought he was going to go back to f6, in which case I would have played knight d2, so as not to let him in. Should I have been playing g4 there? Maybe not. I'm playing very not aggressive here. I was going to play knight to d2, but then I changed gears and thought maybe, why not play this? Yeah, I can think about playing e4 right away, or do I want to play knight d2? Let's just not dilly around here too much.
Check.
I do know in these Blitz sessions that my weakness often has been overlooking knight forks. Like there. Where is he going?
Check.
I want to keep the knight out of c4, I think. A friend of mine in Houston years ago told me that
server announcement.
Okay, now we offer to trade. I don't think he can trade. Okay, so now we got him a little passive there. We can go this way. Offer to trade. Maybe b3 and then c4 was a little better. But it's a bit passive for him. His knight's tied down. Oh, we could have checked and plucked that a6 pawn. That would have been a baby. Ah, but then you got to watch out for knight h6 taking on g4, counterplay. But again, like Floor, don't have to rush here. Take our time. Now, if he goes a4, I'm thinking I'll take, because it's very risky for him to take on c4. Then I'll have an outside passed pawn there. Now, can we afford to go check and take
Check.
that? I think so. Not a very exciting game to be sure, but okay, what's he going to try? He's going to try knight d6.
Black resigns.
Okay, good game, sir, but I think in the opening, after sacking the pawn, queen d7, some plan with castling queenside to try and make it a little more imbalanced. I think that might have been a little more dangerous way to go. Okay, I think we got time for one more game today. And then we're going to have to call it. And I see Eva Pereira, amazing fitness champion from Brazil, is on. Okay. Najmed, you up for one more game? And then we'll call it a night?
Incoming challenge.
Okay.
Game started.
Ah, why not? He's right. I should learn this opening. Should not be afraid. Yeah, this is a funny move. I know there's some business with queen h5 check. Now he's going to attack me like nobody's business. For sure, not a theoretical move, bishop d3. Does have some interesting thoughts, though. Whoa, take human bites, please. Players will note a definite hesitation there. Now he's getting what he wants. Oh. And this is not good at all. He is all over me. I had trouble finding that move.
Server announcement.
Quick! Quick! Before he kills me. And he is trying to kill me, make no mistake. Break that pin. Otherwise knight g4 was coming. This is still a bit of a dogfight. Can I get him off my case before I get checkmated? No, he's all in, baby. Okay, it's pretty clear that threatens checkmate. Oh! 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 I see the light. If I take this guy, I get rid of that pawn. I guard h2, f2 is guarded, d4 is guarded, and I think we'll live to fight another day. Yeah, I was looking at scary variations like bishop takes g4, bishop takes g4, pawn to f3. Oh, tricky guy. Okay, got it. Okay. Anyway, let's just play e5, keep that bishop on the board just a little longer to keep our king safe. So yeah, a while ago I was looking at bishop g4, f3, castles queenside, pawn takes knight on g4, bishop on g4, rook takes d4, splat. And I would be toast. And not cinnamon raisin toast, more like burnt toast. Okay, now though, I think we are in control. A little love tap on his queen, not pawn to g3, queen takes h2 mate. Oops. But bishop g3, got our king side tight, and we are going to try to steal that bishop because that's the kind of thing we do. And I think we can beat back the attack. Okay, now he's in a pin there. If he's not doing anything nasty to me, rook takes f2. I have rook takes. I don't take with the bishop and get mated. No. And now I got a nasty threat to play pawn to h3 if he plays takes on d6. And I don't really see that he can do anything that's too dire and threatening here. Rook lift, rook f6 is too slow. I'll play pawn to h6. But you always want to be thinking, what are they going to try? Because they are going to try something. Probably his best bet is to backpedal out, but then, you know, that's kind of admitting defeat. I mean, at this point, I'm a solid piece, a few pawns ahead. Just have to play a bit carefully, and it should all be okay. But even when you're winning, you always want to be thinking, what can they do to me? How could I mess this up? Bam! See what I mean? There it is. Boom. Well, let's take with the rook.
Incoming challenge.
I got to go, guys, because I have a parent-teacher conference in about 6 minutes. And I will see everyone next week. Thanks so much to ICC for sponsoring. Thanks to everyone that showed up to play.